Welcome to the Korea Society's live webcast. I'm Jo, Senior Director of Arts and Culture. Bong Joon Ho, Dissident Cinema, is the first definitive critical and visual survey of the Academy Award-winning South Korean writer-director who has been making critically acclaimed feature films for more than 2 decades. Designed by the London-based film magazine Little White Lies, this lush monograph surveys Bong Joon Ho's full body of work, including his short films and music videos. Karen Han is the author of this book. She is a culture writer and a screenwriter herself. Her writings can be found in outlets such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, and many others. She joins us live from Los Angeles, where she lives. Welcome to the Korea Society, Karen.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm so excited to chat with you about my favorite director's movies.
A quick note to our viewers who are joining us for this live webcast. If you have any questions for Karen regarding Bong Joon Ho's films, please send them via email to artsandculture@koreasociety.org. So Karen, the book is not a biography, but it is organized in a chronological order. And we also get sort of the sense of a progression of his career. So for those viewers who have not read the book yet and who are not as familiar with Bong Joon Ho's earlier works, can you tell us a little bit about his early years and his path to filmmaking?
Yeah, so I would say that he had kind of what you would think of as a typical path to film, and that he started out studying film and like making his own short films and using that as a kind of platform to jump into doing feature work. He didn't start as a director, but worked as, for instance, an assistant director on films where he would meet some of the actors that he would later work with on his features. And his first feature, Barking Dogs Never Bite, was actually a big flop in the Korean film industry, despite doing relatively well in the international film festival circuit. And he's been quoted as saying, I think, a few times that he thought, purely because of the reception that that film got, that he would be chased out of the Korean film industry forever. Luckily, that wasn't the case. And his second film, Memories of Murder, was a huge hit in Korea and abroad as well, and led to The Host after that, which at the time became the highest grossing film for South Korea. And since then, his profile has really only kept rising with, for instance, international co-productions like Snowpiercer and Okja, and of course, his most recent film, Parasite, which made history, taking home both the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film and Best Picture, which had never been done before. And he has a new movie coming out, hopefully, I think next year, 2024 is when it's slated to come out, called Mickey 17. So it's an exciting point to be at, where it feels like for any director, this would be such a great like climax to your career, but he's still growing, he's still making this incredible art. And we're really lucky to be seeing that happen.
So let's talk about the title of your book. What did you mean by dissident cinema?
Probably, as I think anyone who's trying to title anything can guess, this was one of the things that we kind of went back and forth the most on, for me and my editors and my publisher. Dissident cinema was something that we settled on. The word obviously brings up a lot of typically political connotations, because it's used usually to describe someone who's rebelling against an authoritarian sort of government. And we ended up thinking that it was appropriate in this case as a title for this book, partially because he is very politically minded. He's spoken very openly about being a protester when he was a student, and his movies also have a lot of political themes in criticizing the government, not just at home, but abroad as well. And at the same time, beyond a political framework, his films, I think, kind of push against the boundaries of what we expect to happen in movies, not just in terms of how he winds together different genres, different tones. Like one moment you'll be laughing and the next you'll be crying, and you won't understand why that's happening in a movie. As well as, for instance, his movie, The Host, it defies monster movie conventions by showing you the monster almost the first thing, whereas most of the time the convention is to keep the monster until the end, so you're waiting for that reveal. So he's a dissident in, I think, multiple senses. He's just someone that you can't really predict, who's pushing against the standard, and is all the more exciting for doing so.
You mentioned that sort of his path to
Mhm.
becoming a filmmaker was kind of conventional and not too different. Can you tell us a little bit about what it meant for him to become a movie director and what sort of the process was like? And also, we should mention that he's sort of appears with, another really famous Korean film director like Park Chan-wook. Are their career kind of similar, sort of, getting to that point of making your first film? And what kind of network did he have? What kind of work did he have to do? I mean, I think he mentioned many times, and it's mentioned in your book, how, he really couldn't make a lot of money working as assistant directors and things like that. So can you tell us a little bit about that journey before he became the
Of
Bong
course,
Joon-ho?
yeah. So when I say conventional, I mostly mean in terms of like kind of the idea of working your way up a ladder or taking less senior positions before becoming director, as opposed to having a large bundle of money fall in your lap and just being able to go straight into directing. And I would say that in that sense, his career is sort of similar to Park Chan-wook's in that they both like had some prior experience in the film industry prior to becoming directors. And that period seems to have been very important as far as networking goes, as you were saying, where it was his short films that initially attracted the attention of Park Chan-wook, who wanted to work with him, even though they only really ended up collaborating in a larger way with Snowpiercer, which Park Chan-wook helped produce. But a lot of the connections that he made then were still important. For instance, there's a series of interviews that comprise a chapter at the end of the book, and one of them is with Che Tae-young, who is the only person who's really worked on every single one of his movies, I believe, as a sound editor. And he was saying that they first met like during those early days before Bong was a director and when they were still kind of both working their way up the ladder. But the fact that that collaboration has lasted all these years, I think is a testament to sort of like that experience of all being in the trenches. Because I think anybody who's worked a job that's like relatively low on the ladder at any company has had this experience where the people that you bond with the most closely are the people who are in a similar situation to you and kind of working their way up. And once you are at a position of success, it's easy to keep working with those people because you have the pre-existing relationship, you know what they can do, and moreover, you trust them with your work.
So just to be clear to our viewers, if they're not quite familiar with, how old it is, we're talking about he went to college like at the late 80s, correct? And then he was working in this sort of working as film crew during the 90s. And his first feature, Barking Dogs Never Bite, was released in 2000.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned, it was a commercial failure. And then he writes and directs his second film, Memories of Murder, which was released in 2003. And as you said, this was a turning point in his career. It was a huge commercial success, as well as a critically acclaimed film. When you watch this film now, what stands out for you? And what do you think made this film so successful?
I think part of it is exactly how he tackles the case. For context, the movie revolves around what's considered to be South Korea's like first serial killer case, which in a very strange turn of events was only resolved during Parasite's press tour leading up to award season, which is so weird. But it's the fact that it focuses less on the idea that justice has to be done and more on the struggles of the people at that time, not just the detectives who are kind of bending over backwards trying to figure out what's going on, but the people who are directly affected in the town and trying to kind of reckon with the fact that this horrible thing is happening. It's also, I think, very unique in that it doesn't paint these detectives just as heroes. Like the methodology that they use, they brutalize the people that they think could be suspects and actually cause a man to leap to his death. They're not heroes in any typical sense. And the ending is open because, particularly because at that time, like the case had still been unsolved when the movie came out. And I think he said before that producers sort of insisted that he wrap up the ending somehow, that he fabricate an ending in which they find the killer, and he refused to do that because he thought it would kind of fly in the face of everyone who had actually suffered because of this case. And it's that, I think, determination to tell a story kind of emotionally as truthfully as possible, even though obviously a lot of the details are changed for this fictionalization, that makes this movie stand apart. And then there's also the fact that this is his first collaboration with Song Kang-ho, who I would say, like most people would say, is his muse, given how many of his movies he's been in. And it's such a remarkable collaboration, because I think if you watch this movie on its own, you wouldn't necessarily guess this was the first time that they'd worked together. They really just seem to click in terms of how Song understands the material and how Bong like captures that performance. And it's just remarkable on every level.
But as you said, it's a very dark film, and there's no heroes or villains. Or I mean, there is one person that we think is a villain, but at the end we are not quite even sure. It's such an ambiguous film. What do you think? What do you think that says about the Korean, if you can, Korean film sort of watchers of the time who accepted this film and made it into such huge commercial success? Do you think there was sort of a difference in the audience sort of expectation of what a film is supposed to be when it was released?
I think that has a little bit to do with it, because one of the things that has been said, like in retrospect, about Barking Dogs Never Bite specifically, is that it was ahead of its time. And I think if you watch it now, you can sort of see that. Like there are a lot of kind of quote unquote like Bong trademarks in it in terms of how he tells the story and a sense of humor. And I feel like if it was released kind of even if just a few years later, it would have maybe had a better popular reception, which I think is sort of the case for what's going on with Memories of Murder. And it's also worth pointing out that Bong Joon Ho and a lot of his contemporaries are considered part of the Korean New Wave, in which film kind of was more openly critical of basically everything, like a little less anodyne or saccharine, and more willing to explore like both the good and the bad things that were happening in life.
And he wasn't the only one who was doing it, but obviously was sort of in the forefront of doing that. And The Host, which followed in 2006, as you mentioned, it was, in fact, I think at the time, the highest grossing South Korean film. It was also his international breakthrough. I think some people did watch Memories of Murder, but it was sort of the festival circuit type of thing, while The Host was actually released commercially and it did quite well. What do you think? Do you think he was sort of viewed differently when he first sort of burst into the international film market? I mean, by the time The Host came out, I think there was a huge expectation for Bong Joon to do well in Korea. But when The Host came out and how it became sort of a commercial success in the West, do you think there was a different way of viewing Bong Joon Ho as a filmmaker in the West versus in his home country?
I feel like maybe a little bit, because I know that around the time that Memories of Murder and The Host came out, like some Western filmmakers in particular were championing his work. Like I know Quentin Tarantino, for instance, has multiple times put Memories of Murder like on his best films of the 2000s list and things like that. So there's definitely more awareness. And I also feel like the fact that The Host achieved such relatively mainstream success in the West, I think, had a lot to do with the way that Bong was using genre. Like, I think Memories of Murder, to a certain extent, you could describe, if you're being very simplistic about it, as like a more Korean film, like because it is dealing with a piece of Korean history, is a period piece essentially, and doesn't really have anything blockbustery in the way that The Host does, and that it has a monster that is its kind of central creature. Because when you're watching The Host, I think it's much easier to take it at face value in a way that it's harder to do with Memories of Murder, because Bong's films tend to sort of layer these ideas where it's like, here is the kind of log line, and that here are all the other things that Bong's trying to do within the context of this film. And for The Host, it's easier to say like a girl got kidnapped by a monster, or like a monster is raging through his hole. Like that is a very easy thing to sell and to sort of take in, even though there's a lot of commentary going on as to like the American military presence in Korea and the Iraq War. there's a lot of other things he's trying to say, but it's easier to sell to a popular audience.
But then after that, he made a film that's completely different. I would say probably one of his darkest films.
Absolutely, I would say that.
Mother. And what's really, especially for Korean viewers, what was really interesting is his use of the actress, Kim Hye-ja, who, for people who are not really familiar with her, she's sort of like truly sort of the holy mother figure to a lot of Korean audiences, because many people grew up watching her playing a mother figure in television dramas. She didn't make a lot of films. She was mainly known as a television drama, not to mention she was a spokesperson for this particular brand of food product. So she had this very particular image, which was warm, something that's very almost comforting. Then comes the movie Mother, which completely sort of flips on that image that she has. I mean, I'm not saying she's known as one of the best actresses in Korea too. And she certainly shows what she can do when she's given different material when she's in this film. So can you tell us a little bit about Bong Joon Ho's use of actors? As you said, Song Kang-ho is kind of his muse, but he plays wildly different characters for Bong Joon Ho. And his use of actresses like Kim Hye-ja or even Won Bin, who is, was simply, known as one of the best looking guys. And then he's able to use him in certain way in The Mother. So can you tell us a little bit about his relationship with certain actors and how he uses the actors?
Yeah, absolutely. I think his relationship with his actors is kind of one of the most interesting things to think about in his filmography, because he tends to, I don't think it's necessarily that he's always looking to subvert expectations as to an actor's public image, but he's certainly looking below the surface. He said before that he tends to look at an actor's eyes before he casts them. He said this, I think, specifically with regards to Park Myung-hoon, I think was his name, the guy in the basement in Parasite who has those amazing, who's able to like bug his eyes out in an amazing way. But if you look at the other actors he's cast, I think you can sort of see what he's getting at. Like, for instance, with Kim Hye-ja, what she radiates generally when you see her at a press conference or like in a commercial or in many of her other roles, what she really radiates is warmth and care and like worry over you. And his idea for Mother basically came from, what if you took that one step further? Like, what is the next step after that in terms of love? Like, it turns into a kind of obsession, and he wanted to explore that in Mother. And he cast similarly, I think, for Memories of Murder. Like, he cast Park Hae-il as one of the suspects because he thought that he had such a kind of pure or innocent kind of countenance and gaze, and turning him into a murderer was something that he thought would unsettle the audience even further. He does this also, I think, with casting of, for instance, Chris Evans in Snowpiercer, where he had already been known as Captain America when that movie came out. And then you have him as this character who's supposedly a leader, but ends up kind of carrying one of the movie's darkest and grimmest secrets. And almost succumbing to the evil that he's supposed to be overcoming. And he does this with Tilda Swinton too, I think, where like our impression of her is like very ethereal, but he tends to cast her in the most kind of cartoonish and garish roles to great effect. So he's definitely looking out for what he can do with the actors in a similar way that he's looking out for what he can do with balancing genre and tone.
And as you mentioned, Snowpiercer and Okja, which Tilda Swinton was in both of these films, and there were international co-productions. What was his journey as a Korean filmmaker navigating sort of the non-Korean film industry and the international market?
It's, I think, notably pretty fraught, like kind of down and then up, where Snowpiercer, I think at this point kind of infamously was kind of cut to shreds by Harvey Weinstein, who was one of the producers on it. to the point that he kind of had to fight or justify the choices that he was making, and relied upon, in the end, a word of mouth campaign to get the film a larger release. Because I believe the compromise had been they would release it with his cut, but much more limited release, as opposed to Okja, which he got kind of a blank check, like he could do whatever he wanted. That was a very, very early period of Netflix starting to work with filmmakers to produce their own original films. And he was lucky enough, I think, to be in that cohort where he could do whatever he wanted with that money and made a film totally on his own terms, as opposed to having to deal with that in production. And in speaking about that Snowpiercer experience, I think he said that if it got released by the Weinstein cut, he would have taken his name off of it. Like he is a director, like all directors, I think, who wants Final Cut over his products.
But then he goes back to Korea, and everybody was wondering, is he kind of giving up? But then when he goes back to Korea, then he makes his most successful film. But before we get into that, you write that his nickname in Korean film industry is Bongtail, which means basically, it's his surname and detail kind of combined together. What does that mean? And what do you think that tell us about him as a filmmaker?
So the reason that nickname came to be is because he's known as someone who's very particular about his movies. Like he kind of has an idea about everything. He wants everything a certain way. He, funnily enough, has professed that he does not like that nickname because he thinks it sounds pretentious. And I think if you heard that outside of context, you would think that too. Like it sounds like a director who's kind of a pain to work with. But the strange thing is that, by contrast, like all of the stories from his collaborators, not just that I personally heard for the book, but just in general, if you read interviews and stuff, it's the impression that they give off is of a very generous and collaborative person. Like he works with the same people over and over again, I think, for this reason, which is like it's all in service of the art as opposed to in service of what he wants, if that makes sense. He not to bring up Taeyang again, but he was talking about a certain sound mix that he was trying to do for a film for Bong. And Bong, not being a sound editor, couldn't really describe what he wanted. Like I think this is true of anyone who's not in a certain field. You just don't have the terminology to talk about what you want to the deep level of detail that you want. And it got to the point that Taeyang got so frustrated that he just like shoved the soundboard at Bong and was like, you do it, like you just do it, if you know so much, like you do it. But his answer, instead of like trying to do it or getting angry, was just like, oh no, like, like you can do it. Like, I know you can figure it out. And the thing is, he then did and has used like a similar technique on a lot of Bong's films like since then. Yeah, it's a funny nickname in that what it suggests is different from what I think it ultimately means.
So do you think, I mean, ultimately as a director, when we have an idea of an auteur or a director, or a director who has achieved sort of the success and recognition that Bong Joon Ho gets at this point, we tend to think of sort of the visions they have, the particular stories they want to tell, or the kind of designs that they do. Do you think ultimately, like, what matters as a director is that you are a good leader of people?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's what makes it a really difficult mission to take on. Like you're working with so many people on all levels of the production, and it's your job to be able to tie it all together in a coherent, not just coherent, but hopefully appealing way for other people. But at the same time, you can't worry too much about popular appeal, or otherwise you're not going to make a story that is doing very much.
So then, what do you think makes Bong Joon Ho's film a Bong Joon Ho film? Is it the stories, the ambiguous endings, the open endings? Is it certain visual flair that he has, the attention to detail? What do you think is sort of his signature as a filmmaker?
I think his signature as a filmmaker is his consideration of story on every level, particularly as it pertains to the human experience. Again, as I was sort of saying with regards to the layers, like you can define the host as a girl gets kidnapped, and obviously that immediately creates the sense of dread or panic But then outside of that, it's about these family dynamics, how this family works, how they relate to each other, and how they then will have to work together to rescue the daughter, what she's doing on her own in the tunnel. There's just layers and layers and layers upon that. And I think the thing that he really taps into by focusing on that is that there's not necessarily just one prescribed emotion or answer to any particular question or situation. Often they all mix, and he's not afraid of mixing those two things together. I think one of the scenes that often gets referenced from Bong's filmography in terms of his being able to perform this juggling act is the like mass funeral scene in The Host, where like all of the victims' families from the initial monster attack are gathered in this kind of arena and are like wailing and crying. And it's really tragic on the one hand, but then there's also like an announcement being like, lady, you have to move your car, like in the background, and then like the reporters coming in, like a guy slipping and trying to play it off. Like there's just this interweaving of humor and drama that feels really bold in a movie, but I think if you were experiencing this in real life, wouldn't be all that strange. Like life is constantly a series of contradictions, and he really manages to capture that in a way that few filmmakers do.
Hmm. So then, can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you came to write about film and popular culture, and what led you here, and how did you get started?
Yeah, forgive me if this is a bit convoluted, but I've always had an interest in movies and television and storytelling as a medium. And when I went to college, I majored in art history, and that was kind of the main thing that I was kind of interested in using my degree for, was talking about film and TV. And after I got out of college, like I had a series of day jobs that were like kind of peripherally related to the arts. But as I was doing that, I was thinking about that old like passion for film and TV and wondering like what I could do with it, what the kind of next steps were. And what I recalled was that I really enjoyed being able to talk about this stuff with my peers and have a discussion about what we thought about it. And to a certain extent, that's what cultural criticism is. It's like you're arguing your point and then kind of opening up the floor to see what others think about it, to absorb other schools of thought. And as a result, like I would go to my day job, I would then after that go to a movie and then try to write down what I thought about it, or write about just generally about film and TV. That I built up enough clips to like submit to some kind of smaller websites, and that led to being able to submit to larger websites. And that really was the beginning of my career as a critic. And I was a full-time critic for a few years, which I found like tremendously rewarding. Like it's a tough space to be in. Like I wouldn't necessarily recommend that anyone try to go into media as a career path in general, but it can be really, really rewarding, especially if you find like a good group of people to work with. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
As for how I came to the book, I was lucky enough to attend the Cannes Film Festival in which Parasite premiered. And I think talked about it enough after that people sort of were aware that I really liked Bong Joon Ho as a filmmaker. And Little White Lies and Abrams have been doing this series of monographs on directors that are really, really beautiful and that I'm a really big fan of. For instance, Adam Naiman wrote books on David Fincher, the Coen brothers. Hannah Strong just released her Sofia Coppola book a few months before my book came out. And they, I guess, were looking for someone to write on Bong, and they very kindly reached out to me for it. And I obviously agreed because it's a dream opportunity to get asked to write a book.
So it's not a biography in a traditional sense. It's more about his films. So how did you approach writing and sort of structuring and researching for this book? Because you, as you mentioned at the end of this book, there's a series of interviews that you conducted with his colleagues and actors that he worked with. So how did you do the research for how did you approach writing this book?
I was lucky enough to have like sort of examples to follow in the other books that had already been published by Abrams and Little White Lies. And looking at those, I had kind of an idea of how I wanted to approach them. Not all the books approach the films of the directors in question in chronological order, but in this case, I felt that it made sense because you can, I think, while watching these movies, follow the arc of his career, both in terms of like what he's interested in and what he's doing and how his style like grows and develops. And as far as research goes, I would start each chapter pretty much the same way, where I would just watch the movie, and while doing that, and then watch it one more time to take notes while I was doing it, to kind of firm up my initial impressions and think about what I wanted to talk about. And to an extent, I do feel like this was a less daunting task for me than if it was a biography. Like, I think in that case, I would have maybe said no. Because it's a lot more pressure to do that as opposed to cultural analysis, which I find like very pleasurable to do. And in that process, in taking notes and seeing like what kind of a skeleton I could make for the chapter, the holes became pretty evident pretty quickly. Like, I knew like this I needed to know a little more about. And also part of my research for each chapter was basically just going out and reading as much as I could that was out there about each films, particularly in terms of interviews with both Bong and his collaborators around the time of its release, so that I could find like other like basically like pieces of authorial intent that could help shape the chapter. The biography segment was the introduction of the book serves as a little bit more of a biography, in that it has to kind of introduce the reader to Bong if they're not familiar with his life. And so that took a little more significant more research than like the general chapters of the book, because it required like a little more fact checking and it's a little less like arguing something and backing up your point, and more saying like this literally is what happened. But fortunately, a lot of that was also informed like by what I had already written, like because taking things of what he'd said about some films where he's like, this comes from X period of my life, this was inspired by this, a lot of it had kind of filled in already. So it was sort of like putting a puzzle together in that respect, where it's like I had, for instance, like all the border pieces I could put together, but then I had to figure out like what was going on in particular points on the inside.
Yeah, because one of the fascinating thing I read was for each movie, he also added the influence for that film at the end. Like, for example, like Psycho for Mother, and I was just like, that totally makes sense, you know. So was that based on the previous sort of interviews that he's done, where he has specifically mentioned that that's what he was inspired by? And
a little bit, yeah. I knew from the outset that we sort of wanted to do these influence pages, and so as I was going through the interviews with him and press materials that he's been part of so far, like I took note of like what titles kind of kept coming up and what he kept referencing, because some of them also are like his contributions to lists of like best films of the 20th century, or like my favorite 10 films, and seeing what would repeatedly get mentioned was a big influence on that. The influence pages weren't necessarily one-to-one, but in the cases where it did work, for instance, as you said, Psycho with Mother and The Handmaid with Parasite, I definitely wanted to make sure that those things were paired up. But for instance, something like I was very lucky that my editor agreed to let me do one of the influence sections on the manga artist Naoki Urasawa, just because I know that Bong is a huge fan of his work and vice versa, and that graphic novels aren't alien to him. Like, he's very interested in that as a form, and has also said like if he didn't become a director, he might have wanted to become a comics artist, which I think you can tell, like even just looking at his storyboards, they're so expressive and they're so certain in like what he wants to show that it just seemed like a natural thing to include in the book.
And also, I mean, just designing I know you're not the designer of the book, but when you are doing a book about films with moving images and trying to design a book that looks beautiful but also conveys the sense of film in a very static with very static images, well, what's the sort of the thinking behind the whole look of the book itself? And you mentioned that this is part of, you know, the monograph series that they do. Does the Bong Joon Ho book look different from other directors' books?
I think yes and no. Like the principle, I think, throughout the works tends to remain relatively similar, where if a certain scene is referenced in the text, then they try to have that still from that scene, like accompany it. But in this case in particular, I think because it's hard to pull just like one still from a scene, like we definitely wanted to kind of, it's not quite a flip book effect because you're not going through it like this, but have like several images from a single scene to help convey the sense of motion that Bong is like giving in the actual film, as opposed to just having one still image, which doesn't quite capture what we wanted with each scene. One spread that I think about a lot is for the Memories of Murder chapter. I open by talking about a scene in which a woman is abducted from a field on a rainy night. And I knew we had to have like several images from that in there to kind of convey it, because there's several like key moments in that scene. So you can't just pick one, you have to have a bit of a breadth from the entire sequence.
So you thought you were very familiar with Bong Joon Ho's work, and was there anything that surprised you while you were writing this book?
Yeah, there's one chapter towards the end where I talk about his non-feature film work, where I talk about his short films and his music videos. I'd been aware that he had short films out in the world, but I hadn't known that he'd done music videos before. He actually has 2 of them under his belt, both of which star, I would say, pretty recognizable Korean actors. And it was really fun to see like how he works in different mediums. Like even in the short films, I think he feels like he can be much more playful in those, because it's more constrained, because it's not an idea that necessarily has to sustain across 1.5 or 2 hours. And the same goes for music videos, which obviously you only have a certain amount of control over where a music video goes, because the song already exists, the lyric already exists. Like there is an idea that already exists that you can't really tamper with that much. And both of them, I would say, are kind of fantastical in their own ways, in a way that his feature film touches on, but doesn't necessarily go all the way on.
So I wanted to go to some of the viewers' questions. One person asked, you mentioned what his next film is going to be, that we've been hearing about, but with the popularity of Bong Joon Ho and his international success, do you think there will be more international collaboration? So do you know about the upcoming film, if it's another co-production, or what's happening with his, I guess, next film, which everybody's waiting for?
Yeah, I feel like he has more opportunity to do something like this, but I don't think necessarily that's like his end goal. For instance, like I think Mickey 17 is being released by Warner Brothers, or a major studio. So it is a major like American movie, basically, with a Korean director. But in the wake of Parasite's success at the Oscars and all the awards shows, he was talking about like what he wants to work on next. And while he did have like, I think there was one English language movie that he mentioned, which I don't think is Mickey 17, he also had a couple of ideas for like Korean movies that he wanted to make. One of them was live action, and the other one was supposedly like an animated feature about deep sea creatures, which sounds very him. The point being that like I think he will continue to pursue the stories that interest him, rather than necessarily bigger opportunities in that way.
So we have to talk about Parasite, because that's what really brought him sort of to the forefront, and the success of it that no one really expected. Where do you think he was when he made Parasite, in terms in his career as a filmmaker?
The funny thing is, speaking with Hong Joong-pyo, who has served as his cinematographer on a few films now, apparently he was saying like post Okja, he was just like, let's just go back to Korea and make whatever we want and like not worry about an international audience, which is funny to hear in retrospect, because obviously it was such a huge hit internationally. But again, like it sort of goes back to like the previous point where it's like the idea was like he wants to make stories that interest him, which I think is true of Parasite. Like a lot of the themes that are in this movie, like this, to a certain extent, I feel like Parasite feels like an apotheosis of all the stuff that he has been exploring in his film so far, whether it's family dynamics or a class struggle, or the idea that like good and evil are not binaries that you can work with that easily. And I think that focus is what makes it so like thrilling in the end. Like you can tell that this is a filmmaker like at the peak of his craft, like making a story that there are no flaws in the film. Like, I mean, I'm sure like some people like didn't love it as much as I did, but I really do think it's a pretty perfect movie.
What do you mean by that it's a perfect movie then? Like, what do you see in that movie that's almost flawless?
It's just structured so well, where it's like you can sympathize, you can see where every single character is coming from. Like this is one of the other reasons that I love Mother so much, which we touched on earlier, like because people are doing things that are pretty horrible, but at the same time, you can understand like why these things are happening and what the context is for why it's happening. The same thing goes for Parasite. Like you could construe either the Kim family or the Park family as the villains of the movie, depending on what your point of view is. Hopefully you're not subscribing to that particular binary and able to understand like what the various motivations are for each character. And even like within those microcosms, you can tell that there's like a little bit of conflict in how each of them sees the world and sees what is necessary, and sees like what they think is necessary to like move forward or move upward in the world, and the kind of little struggles in between them. It's also like structured so well. When I think about the movie, just kind of on its own, like in my head, like I feel like the twist when like the basement door opens and you discover that there's a sub-basement bunker, it has to happen like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way after the movie, because everything after that is so intense and feels so fast paced. But if you look at the actual timestamps, that occurs exactly halfway through the movie, which is so remarkable to be able to like intentionally or not. The fact that it's structured that way feels just like masterful. And even like the choices of music, the choices of set, like, and the how he's cast his actors, there's not a single thing in that movie that I could think of to change that I think would make it better.
So we talked about a little bit about this. You mentioned how Bong Joon Ho wanting to just tell the story that he wants to tell. And in fact, he writes his own films. And as far as I know, most of the films are sort of his original ideas. Not many of them are based on a source material, like a book. I believe Snowpiercer had a book, but that's very different from what he ended up doing. Same thing with Memories of Murder. It is supposedly based on this play, but it's completely different from the play itself. So can you tell us a little bit about Bong Joon Ho as a screenwriter? And I do also understand he always has a co-screenwriter too. So what does that say about him as a writer?
I think it means, to a certain extent, I think it like also falls under the umbrella of like what your responsibility as a director is. Like if you are not necessarily, like it's good to have a second pair of eyes like on your work pretty much in any situation. And I think in this particular context, it speaks to, like, I think that the interesting thing is like when he'll bring his co-writers in, like for instance, something like Snowpiercer or Okja, like the process has to happen sooner for like sufficient translation to happen. Whereas with Parasite, like he's talked about writing a lot of it on his own, like just in a coffee shop, but is still, the contribution of his co-screenwriter is still like pretty tangible and like not something that you can just dismiss. And I think it just speaks to like his collaborative nature at the end of the day. Like he wants to make sure the story is being told in the best way as possible. He's not necessarily trained as a screenwriter, so having someone there whose job specifically it is to steward the story in that way, I think is an important thing to have.
You also mentioned that he can be very political, and I don't mean that by that he supports certain political party or runs for an office, but he, as you mentioned in your book, he was blacklisted at one point by the Korean government for having sort of the anti-government sentiment. Of course, now that he's an Academy Award winning filmmaker, he's hailed as sort of as hero, hometown hero. What do you think Korean audience's relationship with Bong Joon Ho, and do you think if there's any difference between how non-Koreans view his films versus, does that affect how people view his own films?
I think if anything, it's possible that the Korean public is just more used to it. Like, I don't want to say that in a kind of complacent manner, but they have a better idea of like what's coming. I think especially because Korean audiences just naturally will have a lot more context for some of the stuff that he's trying to do in his films. Like, for instance, like the background protests that are going on in Memories of Murder. If you're not aware of that period of Korean history, that won't really mean that much to you. And the same goes for some of the details that are in, for instance, like The Host, and even in Parasite, where like Kakao Talk gets translated to WhatsApp, but the vibe is like slightly different. Like you understand it a little bit better if you have context for that already, not just necessarily if you're also Korean. I think it's also funny, like just the way that filmmakers who are better known in their home countries than they are abroad, like how the receptions will differ. Like I remember reading that when Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon came out, like it was such a hit in the US, like it was a really, really a critical darling, but that wuxia fans like were kind of like, it's like kind of slow and boring, which seems inconceivable to someone for whom like that was their introduction to this other genre.
Mm. And then one of the viewers asked that for many Americans, Bong Joon Ho is the only exposure to Korean cinema. So what do you think about Bong Joon Ho being a sort of a representative for Korean cinema, whether he wanted it or not? Somehow, in some people's mind, that's the case. Does he want that sort of the mantle, or is he he's not really an outlier though within the Korean film industry? So what do you think is his sort of take on being known as the Korean filmmaker?
I'm sure he would be uncomfortable with it. Like he seems very uncomfortable with being in the spotlight in general. It was kind of funny, like when we were sorting out interviews for this book, we were trying to get Song Kang-ho for this as well. And when we asked the producer, Do-ho Choi, who very generously and graciously worked with us on this, about whether or not we could get him, he was like, yeah, I talked to Bong and he was like, oh, why would I make my friends talk about me for a book? Like, this seems terrible. Like, why would I force this on them? Which I think is like a pretty normal and human reaction to that kind of thing. That said, like, I'm definitely not upset that he is maybe the most well-known Korean director internationally at this point. But obviously, I think the one thing I would add on to that is that there are still so many different, I guess, kinds of Korean film out there, because you can't narrow it down, any scope of film down to any country's film scene, to just one director or just one movie, just because it's sort of like, I don't know, the idea that like maybe K-pop would be representative of all Korean music. It's like there's so much other stuff out there. You just have to take like one more step beyond that. Sort of like what Bong was saying about like the barrier of subtitles, where it's like there's a lot out there that can be accessible for you if you just do like a little more research or try just a little bit harder.
But at the same time, what would you say? Well, let's go back to that whole idea of sort of him inspiring other people. And do we see any of the Bong Joon Ho kids coming up? I mean, we talk about him as this really august figure. He's still actually a very young man. He's the prime of his life, and he's still working very much. But are there any sort of the filmmakers, or do you see any sort of the trend in Korean cinema that is inspired by him, or is he so particular that what he really inspires is for people to be themselves in a way?
I would say that I couldn't name a single, like one person that I think is necessarily like following in his footsteps in that kind of particular way. I think part of it has to do with the fact that if you boiled down like what we've said so far about what makes this film special, none of it would seem very mainstream. Like it's very hard to sell. Like several of his movies, he said, like the producers like, you have to change this ending, or people are like, oh, like people are never going to watch this movie if you just sell it based on like what he decided to do, like for the ending or for the way that the story is told. And I think it's very difficult to get that kind of movie made, especially if you're a young filmmaker. Like you can see this even in the American film industry, where it's increasingly hard to sell any idea that's not based on an idea that has already been successful to some degree. So it kind of comes down to maybe like looking a little bit more at independent film, which I think is harder to do if you are not directly there in whichever country you're trying to find those films from. But still, I guess it's the same sort of answer as I was giving before, where it's like you just have to look a little harder and see what else is going on. But I do think that the final thing that you were saying is very poignant and like a good point as well, where it's like in the end, maybe the message is like, stay true to what you want to make out of it, to what you want to get out of a particular thing and what you want to make.
Another viewer just asked, seems like a lot of Korean cinema and Bong's film in particular explores sort of the what we would normally call unsympathetic characters without investing significant time trying to get the audience to sympathize with them, the way a lot of, I guess, Hollywood films do. Do you think Korean audience has a different implicit relationship with characters in Korean films than American audience to American characters?
I think maybe that view is a result of just the fact that these are the films that have made it over to the US or kind of made it big internationally. Because when I think about a lot of some of the other like big Korean movies that I've seen in the past few years, like a lot of them don't really do that as well. Like there was that like a sort of action comedy that came out, a bunch of detectives who run a chicken shop but do it too well, and so they have to also run the chicken shop. It's like that there's not really that much like character complexity happening in those movies. It's just that the popularity of that movie like remained in its home box office. Like it did not really make it that big here, outside of like the trailer going very, very mildly viral at a certain point. So I think that's more a symptom of like what has been successful internationally. Maybe the fact that those movies like haven't come over as much is just a symptom of the fact that like that kind of facility already exists like in mainstream American blockbusters. Like it's not a niche that people are looking to fill in any way. Or like they don't have, it's like, or there's not enough recognizable stars for a Western audience. It's like there's a boatload of reasons why like we think of only a couple of Korean directors as opposed to kind of the larger body of work that's out there.
The whole industry sort of that is doing, as you said, very different films. Time. But having said that, I mean, you know, especially after the COVID pandemic, everybody's wondering if film, as we used to call it, will still survive. I mean, we were just talking about actually before the program began, we talked about Park Chan-wook, whose you know film Decision to Leave is currently in cinema, and you can't really think of anybody who's more cinematic, so to speak, than Park Chan-wook. Yet his next work is going to be for, I guess now we can't even say television, it's more like streaming service series he's doing, which is a whole, I mean, you know, obviously that involves enormous amount of skills and vision as well, but it's just a very different medium. Can you ever imagine Bong Joon Ho doing like a streaming series, you know, a film that is not, you talk about how well constructed his films are within that 2.5 hours. Can you ever see him doing like longer narratives?
I feel like he could, but I wonder if the inclination is maybe not there. To a certain extent, like he's never made a sequel. Granted, like Park Chan-wook has also never made a sequel, but I think the two series that he is now, like he made Little Drummer Girl and is now doing The Sympathizer, both of those are stories I think he was very invested in. But even then, even so, like he, in a conversation that with Bong actually that went around partially for award season, he was saying that the reason that one of the main reasons he made Decision to Leave was because he missed doing a movie so much, where he was like, I want to make a movie, I don't want to make TV. And I also feel like if Bong had wanted to do a TV project, the opportunity, it's not that he hasn't had the opportunity. Like there was the Snowpiercer TV show, and now supposedly also the Parasite TV show that's supposed to be going forward at HBO. So I think like the door is open to him. It's just a matter of whether or not like he actually wants to step through that.
So we're almost out of time. So you admit in the book that you're the founder of the Bong Hive, which is the nickname for the most ardent fans of his films. So we know how much you love his films, and that shows up in the book, and I'm sure during this conversation too. But if you have to, can you choose your favorite film and why?
Oh, it's funny. I've been asked this question a few times because of this book, and every time it sends me into an existential crisis. But the answer that I'll give is that the first movie of his that I ever saw was The Host, and I think that still has a very, very special place in my heart. Because I found it tremendously affecting at the time, and I still do. Like rewatching it for some of the book events that I've had, I've been like, oh yeah, this is still an incredible movie. Yeah.
And if somebody who's only seen Parasite asked you if there's one other film that they must watch in order to understand Bong Joon Ho as a filmmaker, which film would you recommend?
I think my answer would also be the host to that. Like, I'm very tempted. I feel like my answer to favorite movie of his tends to waver between the host, Mother, and Parasite, but I find Mother hard to recommend sometimes, just because it is the most bleak and kind of cynical of his movies, and it's so emotionally draining to watch that it's hard for me to say you should go watch that without putting that caveat on it. But I think that is also a pretty, I'm saying this a lot, but it's a pretty perfect movie.
Well, thank you, Karen. Once again, congratulations on your book. We wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. This has been really wonderful.
Special thanks to Peter, our IT director, for making this live webcast a possibility, and to Campbell, the Arts and Culture Program Associate, for getting all the questions and doing all the social media postings. And of course, our thanks to you, our members and viewers. We hope you'll join us again. Check out what's coming up on our website, koreasociety.org, where you can sign up to receive our emails or join as a member. And make sure you like and subscribe our YouTube channel. Thank you so much, Karen. It was wonderful speaking with you, and good night to everybody.
Thank you.